a woman defined by a life of relentless abuse. Aileen Wuornos, driven by desperation and rage, became one of America's most infamous female serial killers, leaving a trail of bodies along Florida's highways. This is her story. Today, we'll dive deep into Aileen Wuornos' harrowing childhood, the desperate circumstances that led to her shocking spree of murders, the determined hunt to bring her to justice, and her ultimate fate. It's a gripping narrative that exposes the devastating impact of trauma and the dark paths it can forge. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her early life was a nightmare of abandonment and instability. Her father, a diagnosed schizophrenic, was imprisoned for child molestation and later committed suicide. Her mother abandoned Aileen and her older brother Keith when Aileen was just 4 years old. Aileen and Keith were sent to live with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos. Far from safe haven, this environment was deeply abusive. Lori Wuornos, particularly, was a volatile and violent man. Aileen reported being sexually abused by him and other male relatives from a very young age. She became pregnant at 14 and gave birth to a son, who was immediately given up for adoption. By her early teens, Aileen's life was spiraling. She dropped out of school, became addicted to drugs and alcohol, and was often homeless. She began engaging in sex work to survive, a path that would define much of her adult life. By 15, she had left her grandparents' home for good, drifting from place to place, caught in a cycle of poverty, abuse, and desperation. For years, Aileen lived a nomadic existence, hitchhiking along Florida's highways, frequenting truck stops and bars. She survived through sex work, petty theft, and odd jobs. She was often arrested for minor offenses, but nothing hinted at the violence that lay ahead. Despite her rough exterior, Aileen craved connection. She had a brief, turbulent marriage in 1976 that ended quickly. Later, in 1986, she met Tyria Moore at a gay bar in Daytona Beach. Moore became the most significant relationship of Aileen's life, and Aileen desperately wanted to provide for her. This relationship, however, would also become a catalyst for her crimes. By the late 1980s, Aileen's financial situation was dire, and her desperation grew. She often struggled to find work and provide for herself and Tyria. The frustration, combined with a lifetime of feeling victimized, began to fester into rage. She carried a deep-seated distrust and hatred for men, a product of the abuses she had endured. While Aileen had a history of aggression and instability, the idea of murder had not been part of her public record. However, the confluence of her traumatic past, her desperate present, and her growing resentment towards the men she encountered in her work would soon lead to a brutal, violent shift. The first confirmed murder occurred on December 13, 1989. Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner, picked up Aileen near Daytona Beach. What happened next is disputed. Aileen claimed self-defense, stating Mallory had raped and brutalized her. Regardless, she shot him multiple times and dumped his body in the woods. His car was later found abandoned. Mallory's murder marked the beginning of a terrifying spree. Over the next year, 6 more men would be found dead along Florida's highways, all victims of a similar manner. All were middle-aged men, typically picked up by Aileen, driven to a secluded location, shot multiple times, and then robbed. Their vehicles were often found abandoned. As the bodies accumulated, a chilling realization dawned on law enforcement. A serial killer was operating along the desolate stretches of Florida's interstates. Truckers and travelers grew wary. The victims were often found with little or no identification, making investigations difficult. The killer was clearly targeting men, and a desperate hunt began to identify and stop this unknown assailant. The murders continued rapidly from December 1989 to November 1990. Aileen's method remained consistent. She would shoot them at close range, often in the torso or head, and then rob them, taking their money and any valuable she could find. A critical clue in the investigation became the fact that Aileen and Tyria Moore were often seen driving the stolen vehicles of the victims. They would use the stolen money for expenses, including rent, food, and recreation. This careless use of the victim's property would ultimately help lead investigators to her. The media soon picked up on the highway hooker murders, as they were dubbed. The story of a female serial killer targeting men was unusual and sensational, capturing national attention. Fear spread through the communities along the I-75 corridor, and local authorities were under immense pressure to solve the cases. Aileen later claimed that all of her victims had attempted to rape her and that she had acted in self-defense. However, physical evidence and later confessions contradicted this, suggesting many of the killings were premeditated robberies that escalated into murder. Investigators initially struggled to connect the various murders across different counties. There was little forensic evidence at the crime scenes, and the victims' cars were often abandoned far from where the bodies were found, making it difficult to establish a pattern. A major break came with the murder of Peter Seams. His abandoned car was found near a motel where Aileen and Tyria Moore had recently stayed. Fingerprints lifted from the vehicle matched those of Aileen Wuornos, who had a record from previous arrests. This was the first concrete link to a suspect. Police began to focus on Aileen. After receiving a tip that she was frequenting the Last Resort, a biker bar in Port Orange, Florida, detectives set up surveillance. They observed Aileen, often with Tyria Moore, and eventually closed in. Aileen was finally arrested on January 16, 1991, at a biker church in Volusia County. Tyria Moore was located shortly after and facing potential charges as an accomplice. She agreed to cooperate with the police. Over several days of intense interrogation, Tyria called Aileen, who, believing Tyria was in trouble, confessed to the murders over the phone. These taped confessions were pivotal. Once in custody, Aileen initially maintained her self-defense plea. However, after learning of Tyria's cooperation and facing mounting evidence, Aileen broke down and confessed to all 7 murders. Her confessions provided chilling details, though she continued to assert that she had been provoked by her victims. Aileen Wuornos' first trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. Despite her claims of self-defense, the prosecution argued that the killings were premeditated murders committed during robberies. Tyria Moore's testimony and Aileen's confessions were devastating. The jury found Aileen Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder. In a highly publicized decision, the jury recommended, and the judge imposed, the death penalty. Aileen became the first female serial killer in Florida's history to be sentenced to death. Over the next few years, Aileen was tried and convicted for 5 more murders: David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Gibson. She received multiple death sentences for these crimes. Aileen spent years on death row, her case becoming a lightning rod for debates about capital punishment, the psychology of serial killers, and the impact of childhood trauma. Her mental state was often questioned, with some experts diagnosing her with antisocial personality disorder and borderline personality disorder, while others argued she suffered from more severe psychosis. In her later years on death row, Aileen's mental health visibly deteriorated. She became increasingly erratic and often lashed out at her lawyers and the public. She eventually dismissed her appeals, stating she wanted to be executed, a decision that further fueled public debate. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Her final words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Lord, and I will be back." She was 46 years old. Aileen Wuornos' case remains a complex and disturbing one. It highlighted the vulnerability of those living on the margins of society and sparked discussions about the role of self-defense for victims of abuse. While her crimes were undeniably horrific, her story also serves as a tragic reminder of how deep-seated trauma and a lifetime of violence can shape an individual and lead to devastating consequences. Aileen Wuornos' story is one of profound tragedy and brutal crime. What are your thoughts on her case? Do you believe justice was served, or do you see her as a victim of her circumstances? Share your comments below. And if you're interested in more true crime narratives, hit that subscribe button for our next deep dive.